Stop it now! I have to do this. You can't.
The wheel bit into wood as the window turned. Ropes pulled tight until the wound, bearer hissed, and muscles carved into visible lines beneath sallow skin. Doubt tightened the chronicler's hands around his ledger within that first minute. Doubt that recording would be enough, and he stepped forward with a pen waiting. The window watched the gears with the same calm used when tending a forge. The chronicler did not speak at once. He measured, wrote, and breathed through cold, precise sentences as if cataloguing parts on a shelf. He had come that night expecting punishment described in legal terms. He had prepared to note time, condition, and cause. What he found was an ordered procedure. The Taos rack was set at calibrated notches, and the window ticked them off, while the candle flame shivered against the stone. The chronicler's ledger listed names and dates on the first page, his handwriting steady, his spectacles lowered. Yet every entry now pushed against a line the man had not drawn before. The wound, bearer strained on the frame, hands bound in old rope abrasions, breath tearing through teeth. He tried to lift his head. His voice came as a raw thread. "Please," he whispered, "please. Record the angle of the elbow." The chronicler without looking up. He had learned to use commands when the room required order. He bent the page and set the pen against new pennings. Tensile strain at 125 degrees, tendon alignment deviated, right wrist abrasion pattern identical to past entries. His voice remained placid as a slate. The ledger took every measurement the window supplied. The window spoke as a man reading a machine, 30 turns. Observe the patella rotation. Note the shift. He placed a gloved thumb at the rack axle, checked a gear tooth and turned again. His movements were slow and exact. He made a small notation in a pocket notebook, the same motion he had performed for years. He did not look at the wound bearer when he spoke. The chronicler moved closer and the scent of pipe smoke and cold paper closed in. He had worn the scholar's coat every day for 20 years and carried the leather, bound ledger as if it were a talisman. He had a pocket watch, brass and quiet. He felt the watch press through the cloth at his side when he bent. He touched a page with a finger that bore a faint scar along the left brow from another life. And he found his pen searching for language that would render broken bodies into neutral data. Name. He asked finally like a clerk who had opened a new file. The wound, bearer coughed, Thomas. Thomas Reed. I was seized at the marketplace. He the name with the flatness of someone who had rehearsed the line and now only had time to speak what mattered. Thomas Reed. The chronicler repeated aloud and set it on the margin. He watched the way the rope cut into flesh at the wrist and how the fingers twitched when the tension rose by one notch, position 0 to notch 3. Note gait impairment, he wrote, then hesitated over the phrase gait impairment and kept the pause long enough to be measured. A shift moved through the room then, one of the first emotion shifts of the night. The chronicler felt suspicion grow into a controlled curiosity. He stepped off the platform and crouched to read the gear teeth at the rack's base, noting numeric marks where other hands had engraved numbers in soft iron. He found a faint notch with chalk dust and circled it on his page. The window watched him while his gloved hand rested on the winding key. You mark the same notches every time. The chronicler, is this a punishment or a test? The window did not smile. Both, he said. Calibration matters. Variance would ruin the record. He tapped his notebook. You know how it is, chronicler. Precise cause, precise effect. His voice was low, practical. The wound bearer tried to speak again, and the chronicler looked at him. Thomas, tell me where they seized you. The question was procedural, but the chronicler's actions had already moved beyond static notation. He bent forward so his shadow fell onto the man's jaw and forced a clearer word. "Mark it by the east gate." Thomas groaned. "They dragged me for a debt." I lied to buy bread." The reply was small, immediate, and shaped like a confession. That confession shifted the chronicler's frame again. He had been taught to inventory facts without indulgence. Now a line formed between facts and motive. The winder's methodical approach began to look less like enforcement and more like a study. The chronicler stepped to the bench and spotted a sequence of prior entries under a thin dust layer, numbers, outcomes, a notation in cramped ink. Rupture threshold observed. His pen paused over the phrase, and for the second time his stomach tightened. But he continued to write. The winder wound again. The rope rasped. The wound bearer convulsed. "Stop, Thomas." At one point, the word fractured. "Stop. I will tell you, keep breathing." The winder, voice blunt and efficient. He adjusted a small wooden wedge under the wheel, 1 notch each 5 minutes. Observe response. He catalogued the micro-adjustment as if listing temperatures in an experiment. Dialogue here began to carry the scene forward. The ratio of conversation increased as all 3 men traded quick, short statements. The chronicler questions. The winder replied with measures. Thomas offered answers gulling in their vulnerability. Why not bind the legs? The chronicler, eyes on tendon outlines, irrelevant to current axis. The winder, we focus on upper limb displacement tonight. He checked the winding key on a leather thong at his belt and told the chronicler the number of turns he intended. The chronicler recorded each turn, each flinch. He placed his spectacles on the bridge of his nose and counted. As the minutes folded into one another, the chronicler's doubt changed again, this time into a cold, professional resolve to document fully rather than halt the mechanism. He would preserve proof. He himself that observing the limits might forbid further abuse. Those rationales steadied his hand. Third external event, a sudden thud at the outer door made all 3 heads turn. Footsteps approached the iron slab, 2 knocks, then silence. The winder did not break his hold on the crank, but his jaw shifted. The chronicler left his ledger open for a moment and peered at the slit in the door to see the silhouette of another guard passing by. The guard's shadow glided away. That interruption was brief, but it fed the chapter's tension, an event every few paragraphs, as required. The wound bearer tried to make a joke once, a thin attempt at humor meant to distract himself. They should charge the wheel by the hour, he rasped. Thomas Reed. The chronicler corrected quietly, and the ledger swallowed the line. They moved through a sequence of measured escalations. The winder adding small fractions, the chronicler annotating the wound, bearer trying to describe the pain in broken fragments. The chronicler paused at anatomical terms, making deliberate notations. Flexor tendon, dorsal displacement, partial dislocation. He would touch his fountain pen to the ink and circle the words with calm exactness. In the middle section, the chapter deepened into the clinical inspection beat. The chronicler stepped even closer now, chest brushing dust, and knelt to inspect a tendon that had risen under the skin like a taut cord. He reached out, an action that became a test of his own boundary, and he placed a gloved finger near the tendon to check for heat and pulse. The winder watched and said, "There is swelling." Note temperature differential. He tapped his pocket notebook and opened a page of previous entries. Last month the same subject reached notch 20, 1 before rupture. Different weight, age matters. The winder's voice was steady. His reasoning was mechanical, age matters. The chronicler repeated and underlined it. He who authorized this series. Orders from the bench. The winder, paperwork in the registry. He sounded unconcerned, as if digital or physical orders were interchangeable. The chronicler frowned and thought of the registry steps he had taken to reach the dungeon that night. A stamped petition, the magistrate's seal, a curt order citing breach of peace. The chronicler felt a new emotion shift then, suspicion slid toward an uneasy clarity. He began to see pattern where once he had seen a single act. The presence of measurement marks and a notebook of prior tests changed his role from mere witness to potential accomplice. He set his pen to the ledger and wrote the word series beside the subject's name. The wound bearer managed a phrase that sliced through the room's restraint. "They count us for experiments and call it justice," he said in a broken whisper. "They mark us and call it record." The winder did not flinch. Language clarifies, Thomas. Record keeps order. He wound again and checked the gear alignment. A confrontation followed, an argument that composed rapid lines between the chronicler and the winder. It contained 3 short exchanges in quick succession and revealed the moral collision. Who signed these experiments? The chronicler, the magistrate's clerk did. Protocol followed. The winder, protocol does not authorize study. The chronicler shot back, "You are a recorder, not a judge," the winder countered. "And you are an operator, not an ethics board," the chronicler snapped. "We perform duty. Duty requires results," the winder. That back and forth was clipped, each line short and direct. The chronicler's speech tightened. His pauses lengthened when he reached anatomical terms. He could have stopped the night, pushed the wheel, called for the guard, but he stayed to measure instead. Each action tightened a new form of complicity. The winder reached a point on the wheel and paused, fingers white. The chronicler sensed the approach to the chapter's climax. He stepped to the rack's winding wheel and placed his palm on the wood as a neutral note, taking gesture. The winder checked the wedge and turned. The rope creaked. The wound bearer let out a sound that was not a sentence and not a scream, a raw animal output from forced extension. At beat 4, the chronicler discovered the critical notebook on the winder's bench. He had to move to find it. His hand brushed a stained mug and sent a whistle of heat across the candle flame. He opened the notebook with careful fingers. Inside were columns, attempt number, turns, subject weight, result. In the margin a line read, "Rupture at notch 20, 7 for subjects under 30, 6 kilos. That line was a revelation and changed everything. Up to that point they had accepted one-off punishment. Now they faced reproducible thresholds and intentional testing. The discovery produced an abrupt external event. The wound bearer, in convulsion, lurched and jerked the rack S-frame. A small wooden peg snapped and fell between the floorboards with a loud, dry sound that echoed. The chronicler looked up from the notebook and met the winder's eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. That silence functioned as a mid-chapter mini-cliffhanger. Had the chronicler found enough to indict, or would the ledger merely contain another sterile line? The winder moved toward the bench with an unhurried gait, and his gloved hand hovered over the notebook. "You will not carry that out of the chamber," he said quietly. "I will note it," the chronicler replied, his fingers already smudged with ink. He had to choose how to fold the notebook into his record. He felt resistance in his throat. He felt the weight of his pen like an instrument of sanction. The wound bearer, whose voice now slid into thin gasps, managed a short line that cut the decision. "Don't let them write it harmless," he said. "Write what they did." The appeal was raw and immediate. The chronicler heard the plea, and for a moment the old lines of professional detachment wavered. He felt horror like a physical thing in his mouth, another emotion shift, then pushed it under the ledger's order. He wrote, but his handwriting tightened into angles he did not normally allow. He listed specific words: systematic calibration, repeated measures, subject selection by weight and age. He circled repeated. Then the winder argued for one final calibrated increase, one more notch for comparison. He said, "We need the final read. It completes the series." His voice produced the mechanical inevitability of someone closing an instrument's loop. The chronicler hesitated. He glanced at Thomas, who clutched the line and shift and pressed his jaw shut, as if bracing to hold a limb in place. The chronicler's pen hovered above the page. He had a choice: to intervene physically or to record the last measure. He moved his hand an inch and then stopped. That hesitation was a small, decisive action that revealed his internal conflict without long introspection. "No more," he said finally, and his voice was a thin paper. "Not tonight." The winder turned his head. "You decide." He asked, incredulous. "I decide what I will record," the chronicler replied. There followed a short, sharp exchange, 3 rapid lines, where the winder accused and the chronicler defended, each naming the other by role. "You are a chronicler. You must be certain." The winder: "I am certain enough to stop this turn now." The chronicler replied: "You will not halt protocol retroactively." The winder. The winder's hand moved anyway. He cranked the wheel past a small notch. There was a wet tearing sound that all 3 heard plainly. A tendon snapping loose with a sick, fibrous noise. The wound bearer convulsed and vomited. The chronicler's pen fell silent on the page. A blot of ink spread where his hand trembled. That moment marked the chapter's climax. The chamber shuddered with the aftershock of physical failure. The winder stopped and checked the mechanism with deliberate motions while Thomas slumped forward and spat blood at the floor. The chronicler rose, turned the ledger face down for a heartbeat, then resumed his writing as if to pin the event to something permanent. The aftermath was methodical. The winder checked the winding key into his apron and ran his thumb across a gear with the familiarity of a craftsman. He wore a small burn mark on his knuckle and his broad shoulders moved without apology. "We document rupture as data," he said. "Now we note the joint displacement and move on." His tone was practical, the kind that kept men from collapsing. The chronicler recorded each anatomical collapse in crisp terms: tendon rupture, partial dislocation, hemorrhage. He wrote the page as if cutting out a specimen, line by line, number by number. The wound bearer lay ruined, breath ragged, hands shaking where rope had cut into his skin. He whispered indistinct pleas that the chronicler used as quoted fragments in margin notes. Outside, rain began to patter against the tower's outer stones, but the chronicler did not note weather unless it affected the record. He closed his ledger slowly and circled the final signature block. He wrote his name in a small, exact script and dated the entry. The winder replaced the wending key and folded the notebook into his coat with the same motion a man might use to hide an instrument under a shirt. Their actions revealed the room's roles: operator, casualty, registrar. In the final paragraphs, the chronicler moved to the door with the ledger under his arm and the watch heavy at his hip. He stopped at the bench, looked once more at the empty frame where the wound bearer had been bound, and checked that no marks had been disturbed except the scattered chips of wood from the snapped peg. He tucked the pen under his coat and felt the scar along his brow catch the candlelight when he turned. He had made choices that night, silent ones recorded in ink. Before leaving, the chronicler placed a final note on the margin. Complicity recorded. He closed the ledger and let it rest beneath his leather fist. The winder took a breath and said nothing. The wound bearer's chest rose shallowly with a ragged intake. The chronicler left the chamber with the candle guttering, his steps measured on stone stairs that led upward into the tower's bureaucratic hallways. The last event, a guard opening the outer gate to fetch a courier, occurred as the chronicler crossed the lintel. He paused in the corridor, listened to the footsteps recede, then turned and lit his pocket watch to check the hour. The concrete beat that ended the chapter was the chronicler closing the ledger and stepping into the stairwell with the book sealed. A decision taken and recorded rather than undone. The chamber remained with its small traces, a single rope abrasion, a smear of blood, and an engineered device that would be used again. The ledger would travel now through official channels. Whether its ink altered practice or only documented it remained a question for the records. He left the light to gutter and the tower to settle. He moved with the quiet of a man who had done his job and made a small, final action. He set the ledger under his arm and chose to bring the notebook of tests into the registry the following day. That choice was stated as a concrete plan, an action that could change things, even if only slightly, and it was the chapter's last note. Outside the stairwell, rain sounded on the pennants and footsteps resumed. The chronicler paused once on a landing, placed his palm on the cold stone, and felt the weight of ink dry on his hand. Then he descended toward the registry, the ledger pressed against his coat like an accusation he had finally decided to carry. The chronicler lifted the linen and exposed raw tendons as the wound-bearer convulsed. Doubt tightened his fingers around the pen. He felt the seam of uncertainty press under his thumb, and it altered what he would ask of the winder. The winder returned at that instant and bent over the ropes, checking alignment with the practiced, unhurried motions chronicler had watched before. The central problem, whether methodical stretching could be catalogued without breaking the subject, hung in the air like the wet scent of a cloth just wrung. He had come to the tower to register mechanics and measure consequence. The chronicler's ledger lay open on his knee, pages edged with damp from his gloved hand. He wrote numbers as he watched flesh change shape. A gap between tendon and skin, a lengthening of the foot's arch, a cluster of tiny white fibers exposed where skin had parted. He did not write feelings. He recorded force and angle, physiological markers to be compared against other entries in the same sequence. The word doubt, when it came, was not a meditation but a tightened jaw and a careful pause before instructing the winder to apply the next increment. Winder, the chronicler, voice steady, measure 2 turns. Mark the degrees and note muscle response. The winder looked up, the iron winding key hanging from his belt, and nodded slowly. The chronicler, the winder added without urgency. 2 turns, then rest. The wound-bearer emitted a thin, broken sound that cut between the 2 men's voices. Hold him, the chronicler ordered. And the winder placed a hand on the gaunt shoulders to steady the body. The wound-bearer's arms flailed once, a reflex more than intent. A rope rasped against a wrist where old abrasions still ringed the skin. The chronicler set the pen down to watch without mediation. He watched tendon fibers shift under skin, watched knuckles blanch as the winder made the first measured crank. The doubt in him changed form, morphing into an exacting curiosity that demanded a record of what would fail first. They had rehearsed measurements earlier, but rehearsal had been a different thing. A demonstration at the tower where Wood had taken the first talks and cloth had creaked as ropes tightened. Chronicler thought of that demonstration now. He had expected the apparatus to behave like a puppet, predictable under applied degrees. He watched instead for small betrayals. Knots that dug, fibers that frayed, skin that sheared against coarse twine. The winder took the key and turned 2 deliberate revolutions. The rack replied with an economy of sound. Gear teeth sliding, the slow groan of oiled wood. The wound-bearer hissed and muscles knitted into visible cords beneath sallow skin again. The chronicler after a breath, and the winder obliged. Each turn had a label in the ledger. Talk 1, Talk 2, micro shift cry at index 10. The chronicler wrote those labels and the winder watched the marks, counting heartbeats between windings by tapping his boot. The first emotion shift arrived as curiosity moved into unease. Chronicler had expected to catalogue strain thresholds. Instead he observed laceration forming where rope met flesh. A frayed knot had worked loose and the knot's edge began to slice into an ankle, carving a fresh crimson line parallel to a tendon. The winder froze his hand at once and ran gloved fingers along the rope, fingers that bore old colosses and a small burn on the knuckle. Winder, the chronicler, voice clipped. Adjust the knot. Inspect the rope, the winder answered with a short, practical sentence. I see it. I will splice and pad. He stepped away to the bench, fetched a strip of oilcloth, and folded it twice around the knot, cinching it to reduce fray. The chronicler marked the intervention while the wound-bearer gagged on air, each inhalation a ragged number to be noted. An external event occurred. Someone outside the chamber shouted a name, the sentinel's shout, then silence. It was brief, but it changed the rhythm in the room. The winder straightened, checked the trapdoor latch, then returned to his task as if the interruption had never occurred. The chronicler recorded the shout as a temporal marker, writing, "Interrupted at minute 42. They resumed measurements. The winder took up the key and turned in measured increments predetermined by the chronicler's protocol. With each turn the wound bearer's limbs stretched, then retracted in involuntary shudders. The chronicler paused between notations, watching the way muscles failed to contract fully and how the foot's arch migrated toward a fixed angle. He spoke sparse directions, angles to hold, seconds to count, each instruction a pair of statements that kept the procedure within the bounds of his method. "Chronicler," the wound bearer rasped once, voice thin and raw. "Stop them. Stop." He could not complete the sentence. The chronicler's eyes did not soften. He closed them for a heartbeat and reopened them to chart a new data point. This was an emotion shift from unease into a harsh, cold calculation. A recognition that the registry of harm would be written even as harm continued. The winder tightened the ropes by a quarter turn. At that increment the ankle shifted outward. A tendon beneath the skin rose like a taut cord. The chronicler tapped his fountain pen, marking the change. Visible tendon tension increases at quarter-turn increments. He could have ordered the winder to stop. The doubt that had haunted him earlier now bifurcated, a professional insistence to know and a human calculation of cost. He chose to continue. That choice altered the balance of power in the room. It put the chronicler on the side of observation rather than intervention. A frayed knot sliced deeper. Blood wetted the linen. The wound bearer's leg jerked in a reflexive attempt to pull away, but the rack held firm. He shouted a sound with no words and then lapsed into a series of thin gasps. The chronicler hovered over the ledger, recording blood volume estimate and approximate rate of seepage. He felt a tightening at the base of his throat, a physical counterpoint to the eyes' cold accounting. He made another note and signaled the winder, "Hold at this tension." The chronicler, "Apply no more until I write measurements." The winder obeyed. He sat on a low stool and removed his gloves, checking seams and knots. The wound bearer slumped slightly. His hand twitched toward the wound, then fell back. The chronicler lifted the linen again and inspected the tendon where the crimson line appeared. The sight of exposed fiber length did not produce metaphor in him. It produced a numerical problem to solve. How many increments until rupture? How many degrees until dislocation? They continued, and then the deliberate escalation moved into a deliberate, measured cruelty. The winder turned the key more slowly now, 3/4 turns measured against a small, handmade gauge the chronicler had insisted on. The wound bearer cried out with a sound that cut short like a rope snapping. The chronicler recorded the decibel of the cry as a comparative value against earlier entries. The winder tightened one more small click, then the snap occurred. Tendon fibers gave way with a sound the chronicler could name only in comparison to wood breaking under strain. A sharp, wet tearing and a distinct small pop inside the limb. The foot twisted outward as a joint dislocated. The wound bearer threw his head back in a torque that revealed the whites of his eyes. The chamber's air filled with the metallic smell of blood and the raw, acid tang of muscle exposed. The chronicler's pen stopped moving. Everything shifted in a single mechanical instant. Curiosity collapsed into alarm. Doubt became guilt-edged with raw, immediate action. The winder's hands froze on the key. For the first time since the demonstration, the winder's face betrayed a hesitation, a pause in professional rhythm where duty and consequence met. The wound bearer convulsed, then went limp in a way that suggested loss of coordinated control in that limb. "Stop." The chronicler barked, and the single word broke the room's clinical cadence. The winder spun the key the opposite way, and the rack eased a fraction. The chronicler moved in closer and pressed a damp cloth against the wound with both hands, palms slick from soaked textiles. He barked orders that mixed observation with care. Tie the splint. Watch for shock. Record pulse every minute. The winder answered in short lines of service. Splint made. bandage ready, watch set. The wound bearer made a sound like a torn breath and repeated, "Chronicler." Help. This was a second emotion shift, alarm to reluctant caretaking. The chronicler, who had refused to let moral hesitation override the experiment, now alternated between transcribing damage and performing the most immediate aid he could administer. He reflected the conflict in actions, damp cloth, ledger entries, quiet commands rather than in thoughts. Each physical motion signified a collision between the pursuit of knowledge and the presence of someone suffering. The winder bound the limb as best he could under instruction, sliding a strip of wood beneath the leg and cinching linen tight. He spoke only when necessary. "Chronicler, the joint is slipped. Do you want me to reset?" His voice was low and practical. The question contained both expertise and a request for permission. "No reset now." The chronicler replied, "Risk of further rupture." "Stabilize and document," he wrote. "Tendon rupture confirmed. Dislocation present. Immediate surgical intervention required outside chamber." The chronicler's hands trembled once as he sealed the note with a precise, small stroke of ink. The tremor was a physical motion, not a confession. It displayed the emotional change inside him through an observable sign. Outside the chamber, a new event occurred. A footstep, then two voices, officials from another part of the tower, questioning the source of noise. The winder answered the door and repeated two short sentences, explaining the procedure and the accident with measured brevity. The visitors listened only long enough to take a tally of the situation before retreating. The chronicler recorded the exchange. Every external interruption was a time-stamped datum. The wound bearer lay pale and breathing shallowly. The chronicler ordered the stretcher and prepared a terse note instructing the surgeon to expect tendon fragmentation and joint misalignment. He refused to invent consolations. Instead, he recorded the precise location of the laceration. 3 centimeters proximal to the malleolus, transverse incision consistent with rope abrasion and increased tension. He spoke occasionally to the wound bearer in short lines. "Stay with me. Breathe slow." The wound bearer's replies were fragments. It burns. Canti, Danti. A twist emerged in the final third of the chapter. When a previous prisoner brought from the demonstration room was identified by an old rope scar and recognized by the wound bearer as someone who had advised him in secret. The wound bearer muttered the name Thomas and then, with a sliver of clarity, described a conversation he had had nights before with that man who had whispered about the rack's worn spokes. The chronicler had not recorded that man earlier. The revelation required him to add a cross reference in his ledger. The revelation shifted how the chronicler understood prior demonstrations. Perhaps some suffering had been repeated on purpose, a repeated test rather than a one-off demonstration. The twist recontextualized the tower's earlier actions and meant the ledger contained evidence not just of method, but of possible pattern. They lifted the wound bearer slowly onto a stretcher. The chronicler walked with him to the infirmary entrance, pen still in hand, ledger tucked under his arm. The winder walked behind, carrying the winding key, shoulders squared as if to bear the physical residue of what had occurred. The chronicler then made a terse ledger entry. Tendon rupture at minute 59. Recorded interventions. Recommended surgical removal and long-term immobilization. He closed the book with a small, exacting motion. In the infirmary, the surgeon examined the limb and muttered clinical terms that the chronicler transcribed. Partial flexor rupture, probable necrotic risk if not cleaned, immediate debridement advised. The winder handed over his gloves and the iron key. The chronicler placed the key on the table, a small object that had been central to the sequence. The wound bearer's breathing slowed under the surgeon's ministrations. The chronicler stood apart, hands clasped behind his back, and watched a cloth being wiped free of blood. His gaze rested briefly on the ledger line he had added, and then moved to the candle on the table. The final paragraph resolves the chapter's conflict in concrete action. The chronicler made one last entry. Delay in study for ethical review. Note to catalog rope condition across all devices. Cross, reference with Thomas mention. He pushed the ledger closed and slid the iron key beside it. The winder nodded once and left the room to fetch padding and a spare length of rope specifically to be inspected, and retired. The chronicler lifted the candle to bathe the room in narrow light, watched the wick gutter by a fraction, and then snapped the cover shut on the ledger with a motion that sealed the night's record. The chamber remained with one thing unresolved, whether their future pages would justify the damage they had recorded. The wound bearer was moved to convalesce. The ledger contained a new entry that would follow him like a mapped injury. The chronicler walked down the corridor, pen tucked back into his coat, and felt the small, steady weight of doubt behind his sternum, an emotion that had arrived as a physical tightening and that would steer the next decision to resume or to stop. He did not speak about it. He only set the ledger on the table under the guttering candle and left the room's door ajar, a single line of light cutting across flagstone as the next day moved toward noon. The metal key bit deeper as the winder took another measured turn, and the rack answered with a sickening, wooden groan. Doubt rose in the chronicler like a cold knot beneath his ribs. He had thought at first that recording would suffice, and now that doubt drove him closer to the platform. The wound bearer hissed as ropes tightened, breath scraping in short gasps. The winder kept his shoulders even and his hands slow. Within 5 sentences the central problem was plain. The winder had altered the machine to exceed known limits, and the chronicler must decide whether to document that alteration or to stop it. That doubt governed every pencil stroke he made. He crouched at the ledger table with the oil lamp between his knees. The chronicler turned the page, the brass spectacles balanced on the bridge of his nose, and watched the marks the winder had added along the rack S-frame. He had seen the wheel bite into wood before. He had felt the first coil of protest on other wristbands in a demonstration night earlier in the tower. He had recorded a tendon snapping once. That memory lived under his thumb as a factual line in the margin. Now the ledger sat open to a fresh set of notations, and the chronicler's breathing shortened in a way that showed fear through action. Not abstract words, stop there. The chronicler, looking up. His voice held a clinical edge, marked the number, 42.5, chronicler, the winder replied. He did not look at the ledger. He read the notches he had carved. That is where the tendon failed last time. The tendon failed. The wound bearer spat between clenched teeth. Stop the wheel. The winder tightened his grip. Not yet. I need the full sweep. The chronicler wrote the angle, then pressed the nib onto the paper, as if the ink could hold force steady. He had the obligation to measure. He also had the obligation to tell truth. Doubt shifted into a new motion, suspicion of intent. He compared the fresh notches to the rack diagrams clipped inside the ledger. The new notches were paired with a shallow slot beneath the main gear. The chronicler smelled oil and old rope. He felt the ledger's weight at his thigh as a physical presence that could tip a verdict. They had been here before. The first time the wheel bit into wood, sheared a sound of raw wood and cloth, and the wound bearer had arched like a struck animal. The chronicler had noted the sound and lifted the linen and exposed tendons as required by his method. That earlier event played not as memory, but as a recorded demonstration he could open and compare. He himself, the present, was simply the next entry. He himself, his job was to remain a neutral cataloguer. The doubt that had arrived minutes earlier hardened into a practical question. Would neutrality become collusion? A short flare of light from a candle threw the winder's face into relief. He had a burn on his knuckle. His palms were scarred and steady mechanics. The winder, with the same low voice he had used when he taught apprentices to lash, we seek predictable failure. We learn from what breaks. You seek it here. The chronicler shot back. You did not seek permission. The winder's eyes did not change. Permission comes when you show the outcome. The outcome governs permission. A new emotional shift arrived in the chronicler, from suspicion into a cold, clinical anger. He set the pen down. He slid his spectacles up, and the small pocket watch in his hand clicked shut like a verdict. He stepped to the rack platform and inspected the underside of the gears. The paired notches and concealed ratchet were visible where the iron met the oak. They were crude and deliberate. The chronicler ran his fingers along the metal, counting imperfections as if they were words. He catalogued each burr and chip with an internal, silent arithmetic. The ledger waited. The wound-bearer made a sound that was half a curse and half a plea. "Chronicler," he rasped, "please." The chronicler did not kneel. He lifted the linen again and catalogued the exposed tendon with the same dispassionate phrase he used to label every part. "Extensor tendon, partial transection at the distal third." He wrote it down. He paused. He tested the wound-bearer's pulse with 2 fingers on the wrist. The hand was cold. The sound of wood under iron made the room feel smaller, but the chronicler did not name that feeling. He recorded the tightness in his own jaw by checking off time stamps and angles. An external event interrupted the measured recording. A metal bracket gave under strain with a sudden snap that was not the sound of human flesh, but of the rack itself surrendering. The winder muttered and stepped back. The winder, damn. The frame needs a brace. The mechanism was sound. The chronicler, he kept his voice even, but the ledger absorbed a faster scrawl. The winder's hand went to his iron key and rubbed it as a man might rub a worry bead. "You keep calling what I do sound and unsound like it's judgment," he said. "I call it a variable." "I will note it." The chronicler felt a new emotional shift, doubt to suspicion to a hardening resolve to expose the alteration. That resolve showed in his actions. He lifted a lamp and moved to the underside of the rack. Oil flecked his fingers. He traced the concealed ratchet. He counted the teeth. He set the lamp down and tested the wind with a single measured pull. The winder checked tension with gloved hands and did not protest. The wound-bearer screamed as the ropes tugged harder. The sound was short and sharp and immediately cut by the winder's hand on the wheel. "Stop," the chronicler barked. The winder froze his hand. "Explain the ratchet. Explain why you carved notches." The winder's voice dropped lower. "To measure failure point," he said. "To make the pull repeatable. To learn, to make it worse than you were permitted to use." The chronicler countered. The winder looked up at him, and the room narrowed to the distance between their faces. "Learn," he said. "Record. Repeat. We will know the exact force that dislocates a shoulder. We will know degree of tendon snap. We will map injury. That is value. Value for whom?" The chronicler. The winder only checked the wheel again. The wound-bearer coughed and then spoke with more clarity than the chronicler expected. "You both write about it," he said. "You write as if letters make it clean. You write as if numbers are mercy. They are not." The winder did not flinch. "Do you think I take pleasure?" he asked. "I take duty." The chronicler closed his eyes for a moment. The ledger felt heavier. He faced a moral friction that could not be rehearsed. He had been taught to keep distance. He had been taught to observe so that later eyes could judge. But as the winder prepared another calibrated pull, that distance became an action, to step in, to stop the wheel, to place the ledger between a man and the iron. "Stop the next pull," the chronicler. He set the ledger on the racket's beam and rested his fingers on the open page, so that his handwriting would be between the winder and his work. "I will note every angle. I will note every audible split. But if you move past the mark, I will speak the names of those who ordered this." "You will not," the winder replied. He smiled without moving his lips, an expression that did not reach his dark hazel eyes. "You will write. You will make the outcome legible. Name them." The chronicler, who authorized repeatable failure, who paid for the modifications. The winder hesitated. He swallowed and the scar on his knuckle caught the candlelight. The winder answered, "No one named us. The work is uncommissioned but not unsupported. The ledger itself is support enough." Those who read will infer that answer should have satisfied the chronicler's need for a named culprit, but instead it nudged him toward anger. The anger did not blaze outward. It showed in the chronicler's hand as he underlined a notation. It showed in the wound, Bearer's fingers curling reflexively. The winder set his shoulders and began the pull. The climactic moment arrived exactly where the outline predicted. The winder engaged the concealed ratchet and took a final, deliberate extension. Metal settled into wood. The wound, Bearer's body arched and then dropped in a new alignment as several joints popped out of place. The chronicler heard the sound of cartilage moving and the faint, wet noise of a tendon giving way. He did not look away. He catalogued each joint that dislocated. Right shoulder, left elbow, right wrist. He labeled each tendon rupture in the ledger. His writing was precise. His voice was a dry notation when he read aloud, right scapulohumeral dislocation. Extensor tendon proximal rupture. The wound, Bearer let out a long sound that contained no words. He tried to speak anyway. It is worse than last time. He breathed. It's worse. The winder checked knots, and the winding key trembled in his palm. He spoke like a craftsman concluding a trial. Noted, he said, we have a repeatable failure range. We can measure treatment and prognosis now. The chronicler's next movement sealed the chapter's moral weight. He closed the ledger over the newly written lines, and then reopened it to a blank margin where his hand hovered. He penned a single marginal note beside the winder's results. The note was short, precise, and would change how a later reader judged the operation. Modifications present, concealed ratchet added. Potentially willful excess. He did not embellish. He did not editorialize. He recorded. That act was both evidence and indictment. After the final pull, the winder performed procedural aftercare with the same deliberate routine as he had performed the experiment. He soaked cloth in cold water. He bound limbs into splints with practiced knots, and he checked for pulse and capillary refill. The chronicler annotated suture points and swelling measurements. The winder counted the knots and then compared them aloud with the chronicler's notes, swelling to double baseline at 70. 2 minutes, he said. We will measure contracture across the second week. The wound. Bearer made a sound like a man trying to climb out of a well. Why do you write we? He asked. Who is we? The chronicler folded his hands, paper dust coating his fingers. The ledger is the we, he said. The ledger and the tower. We are names on a page. Then write that I asked to be spared. The wound bearer replied. Write that I begged. Write it plainly. The chronicler hesitated and then made a line. Request for cessation recorded. Denied by operator for experimental integrity. He placed the line next to the mechanical readings. The wound bearer watched him write. That watching made the chronicler feel exposed in a way that was not catalogued in any manual. He felt a new, subtle change. His detachment fractured into guilt. The guilt was not declared. It played out in how long he lingered over the winder's signature space. An unexpected reveal shifted the apparent motives of the winder. While checking the winding mechanism, the chronicler found a folded scrap of paper jammed into the brace. Inside, in a cramped hand that matched the winder's sink, were names and sums. The chronicler read aloud, voice steady. Thomas Harrow, £10. Captain Lytton, £5. Anonymous, £20. He read the list again and then compared each name to margins of old entries. One name recurred in a set of previously uncatalogued nights. These were payments. The chronicler, that changes culpability. The winder's jaw tightened. Those were donations to repair the rack, he said. The tower is old. Donations to exceed safety, the chronicler replied. You took funds to modify the device. They wanted results. The winder. They wanted certainty. That disclosure reoriented the chronicler's sense of the operation from isolated cruelty to a network decision. It was a plot twist that altered the listener's understanding of earlier events. The chronicler felt the change as an information shift. The ledger's neutrality could now expose named parties. He put the scrap into his coat and closed the ledger. He wrote a second marginal note. External payments attached to modification. A rapid exchange followed, 3 to 6 short lines that crackled like a spark between wet wood. You served duty. The chronicler, those names mean you served someone else. Those names mean maintenance. The winder replied, those names mean intent. The chronicler shot back. And what will you do? The winder, I will write what I found. The chronicler, that is not justice. The winder hissed, maybe not the chronicler, but it is a record, a mid-chapter mini. Cliffhanger arrived when a distant footstep echoed down the stone stair, and a voice called the winder's name from above. Everyone in the Undercroft froze. The winder turned his head slowly. Who is that? He asked. The chronicler's pen paused over the sentence. He could choose to hide the scrap, to tuck the marginal note away, to destroy a line or two. The external voice moved closer on the stair. The wound-bearer stared between the two men and mouthed a plea that had no sound. The winder set the key back into his apron, and the chronicler slid his spectacles up as if to ready himself to face the caller. The footstep revealed itself to be a messenger with a sealed note for the tower. The messenger did not look at the Undercroft. He only handed his note to the winder and left. The small interruption hardened the decision the chronicler had to make. He could no longer pretend the ledger was merely a neutral record when payments and names might leverage those records into action. Dawn seeped into the Undercroft through a narrow slit, and the light fell across the rack in a thin rectangle. The winder checked the winding key, and the wound-bearer coughed and tried to sit. The chronicler finished the tally of injuries. He stapled a copy of the list of names into the ledger between the diagram fold and the results sheet. He then did something he had not done before. He rubbed a smear of ink across one line, making it harder to read, and then wrote a clarification beside it. He was playing both roles of archivist and judge now. His hand was steady. He felt the guilt he had amassed move into a practical action. He would not destroy the ledger. He would not remain passive. In the final minutes of the chapter, the winder packed away his iron key, and the chronicler watched the man close and tie his leather thong with slow care. The wound-bearer whispered a name that had appeared on the payment scrap. Harrow, he said on a breath. He came to me months ago. It would stop if I confessed to theft. The chronicler wrote the name and then looked at the winder. Did he? He asked. The winder shut his eyes for a single heartbeat and then nodded. Harrow results be expedited, he admitted. He wanted proof that certain men could be broken so they would confess. That admission folded the network of responsibility into a single, tellable chain. The chronicler's final act in the Undercroft was to close the ledger on a page that contained names, notations of fraudulent payments, precise anatomical damage, and his own marginal charge of willful excess. He shut the cover with a measured snap, and then, before he rose, he slipped a single, marginal note that could condemn or exculpate the winder. Concealed ratchet present, likely commissioned through covert donations. Recommend further inquiry. He did not sign it with flourish. He did not leave a flourish of indignation. His hand left the note as an evidence shard. The wound-bearer shifted, and the chronicler felt the man's fingers twitch against the linen. The winder took one last breath and stepped toward the stair. The chronicler did not follow immediately. He ran a finger along the ledger spine and closed his eyes for the smallest fraction of a second. When he opened them, he tucked the scrap of payments into the ledger and slid the book into his coat. He rose and placed the ledger on the bench by the door. The final beat was concrete. A knock on the outer door as a new figure waited to be admitted. The chronicler reached for the handle and let the chapter end on that physical act. The chapter resolved its immediate moral conflict. The ledger now contained the evidence that the rack had been modified and that payments had been made. The chronicler decided to preserve the record rather than destroy it. The winder left to answer the stare. The wound-bearer lay curled in splintered limbs and breathed shallowly. The final paragraph closes on a situation that forces a choice to continue or to act. The chronicler placed the ledger under his arm, walked to the door, and turned the iron ring to admit the next caller. The chronicler's fingers closed on the iron key at the winder's belt before the winder could pull it free. Doubt rose in the chronicler like a cold muscle. He had been a recorder, not an interrupter, and the decision to seize the key split him between duty and mercy. The winder lurched back, one hand still half on the winding shaft. The wound bearer arched and hissed as ropes shifted. The immediate problem was plain. Who would control the rack's next motion, and what that motion would do to a man's body? He did not raise his voice. He kept the ledger tucked under his arm and stepped down from the shadowed gallery to the platform edge. He placed the key on the ledger's open page as if it were evidence to be catalogued rather than a weapon. The chronicler's face stayed composed, but his knee knocked a rung. He could not make the pinia trimmer vanish. The winder saw the movement and reached. "Give it back." "The winder, you will wake more than conscience if you stop this now." The winder's voice was low and hard. It named duty and consequence in the same breath. "Why must you call it duty?" The chronicler, and his pause was not rhetorical, "Why have you logged tensions and trials like experiments?" His voice was steady. His hands, however, would not stop because they were holding the ledger and the key together. The winder's mouth tightened. "Do you know what pain teaches?" The winder answered, "Control, threshold. Where a tendon yields and where it does not." He placed his palm on the rack's shaft, as if feeling a heartbeat prescribed by gears. This was not the first demonstration. The wheel had bitten into wood in Chapter 1. The winder had turned. Ropes had pulled taut. The wound bearer had hissed. The earlier sessions left visible marks. Rope abrasions circling wrists, a gash of bruises across the chest where the ropes had chewed. The chronicler had recorded those first motions as data and as testimony. Tonight, the ledger's margin had numbers and a sealed note tying the entries to a patron. The ledger made private cruelty visible. The ledger made the winder's hands implicated. The ledger shows a seal, the chronicler. He flipped back a few leaves and tapped a margin where neat numerals met a pressed emblem. "This is not mere duty. Who signed these orders?" The winder's jaw worked. He glanced toward the corner, where a chart of tensions hung with pins. "We follow a chain," he said. "You will not break the chain by throwing away tools." "Give me the key." His words tried to collapse moral choice into mechanical obedience. The wound bearer made a sound between a cry and a croak. He had spoken earlier in fragments. Tonight his throat gave syllables that did not resolve into sentences. He coughed. He tried to turn his head. "Please, the wound bearer, please." His voice failed and became a rasp. The chronicler knelt at the edge and set the ledger down between the winder and the wounded man. He let his pen tap the wooden rim twice in a measured rhythm before he spoke. "Tell me the last reading. Tell me the tension where you stopped before this." The chronicler. The winder obeyed in part because habit had taught him to obey mechanical requests. £120 at the third notch, the winder. Then I recorded a trial at 150. The rope gave at 164. The tendon, he stopped. The word did not leave his mouth cleanly. The wound bearer flinched. His breathing came short and ragged. He tried to steady his hands, but they twitched against the rope harness. Physical reaction registered over any remonstration. Clenched jaw, fingers pressing into the wood, eyes fixed on the wending wheel. These were the signs of pain the chronicler had catalogued before. Now they directed his choice. Doubt shifted once more. It grew teeth and demanded a test of will. The winder reached again. His fingers closed on the ledger's page where the key lay. The chronicler caught his wrist. "Do not touch the page." The chronicler, not as a plea but as an instruction. The winder's hand recoiled a fraction. "You are asking me to stop my work." The winder, "You are asking me to waste years of measurements." His voice contained both irritation and a kind of private pride in measuring thresholds. This is not measurement, the chronicler. This is injury with a ledger as its witness. He pushed the ledger open to show the notations, the numbers, the patron's pressed seal. Read this. Read who signed this page. The winder's hand hesitated over the letters. He scanned the name and shut his eyes briefly. A patron gives permission, he said. A patron sets limits. Whose patron? The chronicler. He tapped the seal with a fingernail. Name him. The winder swallowed. Master Aldred. He said finally, Master Aldred, and a counselor I cannot name in the open page. They wanted data to test the body's limits. They paid. We kept records. The chronicler wrote the name on the ledger in a steady script that would later be read aloud in an office outside the tower. That revelation changed the room like a slammed door. The winder's mechanical professionalism now carried a patron's signature. The moral culpability stretched beyond a single pair of hands. The chronicler felt the course of action narrow. The choice was no longer between turning and stopping, but between preserving evidence and preventing immediate further harm. He shifted from doubt to a hard-edged intent. Stop the trial. The chronicler to the winder. Stop it now, or I will name these orders in public registers and take this ledger where the patron's seal will be recognized. His voice made a promise and an accusation in the same sound. The winder's face hardened. You will ruin more than me. The winder, you will ruin men who trust me to do exact work. You will be responsible for more death than this ledger prevents. He jerked his head toward the harnessed man. The wound bearer made a weak laugh. Do not turn the key. He gasped. Do not. He stopped when a rope creaked and his shoulder slid a fraction. The frayed seat at his hip gave a distressed rasp. The chronicler felt the quick spike of fear for a moment, and then shaped it into a question. Which action would most reduce suffering? That force of purpose caused his second emotion shift. Fear softened into resolve to act for documentation and to stop further movement. He moved toward the chart on the wall and tore down one of the pinned sheets. U-160, 4 and the rope gave. The chronicler. He placed the page on the ledger and ran the ledger's pen along the numbers, underlining them. That establishes risk. That proves harm. I can close this without forcing another turn. Tell me where you would have placed the next measurement so I can record it as a stopped trial. The winder did not answer quickly. He was a man trained to think in the language of load and break. That training would not bend easily to conscience. The platform shifted under the wound, bearer's weight as he tried to cough. His knuckles whitened against the tether ropes. The chronicler looked at him, then at the winder. Listen, winder. The chronicler, if you continue, I will write that you continued with the patron's authority. If you stop, I will write that you halted the experiment at my insistence and that the record bears your initials. Which will you sign? The winder's eyes darted to the ledger and then away. He wanted the record of precision more than the record of shame. The winder's hands trembled for a bare second, and in that split, the chamber held its breath. He stepped closer, too close to the winding wheel. He set his gloved hand on the iron key and then pulled it back. If I sign that I stopped, Master Chronicler, the winder. They will punish me for wasting patrons' money. They will find someone who will not hesitate. His voice ended with a small, bitter laugh. Or they will unmake me for false data. He looked at the wounded man as if weighing his own skin against the ledger's truth. The wound bearer slipped words between breaths. You will not. He tried again. He formed a name for his fear that was not abstract, Aldred. He will come if he loses his numbers. He comes with men. The chronicler wrote the name again and felt the page cool under his hand. He made a decision that was half legal, half moral, and then he formed a sentence that did not allow the winder to retreat. Then sign in the ledger now. The chronicler signed that you halted the trial at 160, £4 at the third notch, and that further testing was refused. Sign it and I will place the ledger in the right hands. I will name Master Aldred and his counselor. You will answer for following orders, not for having measured. The winder's jaw clenched. He spat on the floor. "You ask me to betray my patron," he said. "I ask you to choose the lesser crime." The chronicler answered, "Choose stopping now. Preserve what you can of your hands and your conscience." The winder hesitated, watching the wound bearer's chest. The wounded man's breath had begun to stutter in smaller, louder rattles. The chronicler took the pen and set it at the ledger's margin. He waited in a manner that spoke of law more than mercy. For a long second the winder's eyes flicked between the shaft, the key, and the ledger's margin. His fingers closed and opened. Then he signed. He wrote his name in a slow hand, pressed with a palm, and the ink left a mark. He exhaled with the sound of someone who had made an impossible bargain. The wound bearer's shoulders lowered by a fraction, and his face went slack, as if briefly relieved. Emotion shifted again, from moral wrestling into brittle acceptance. That should have ended the scene. The winder stepped back. The key lay heavy on the ledger, and the chronicler slid it under his coat for safekeeping. He rose to inspect the wounded man, but paused when the frayed rope at the wound bearer's hip gave a sharp, wet snap. The sound was never dramatic in writing. It was a precise, terrible thing in the room, fiber against wood, then a pop and a wet, low sound like a reed being split. The wound bearer's body lurched forward, tendon and joint misaligned with a small, clinical noise. Blood did not spurt theatrically. It stained linen in glinting threads. The chronicler had recorded tendon snaps before. He had written words that would later be read by men in rooms with better airs. He had never stood so close to the instant when numbers became ruined flesh. The winder's hands rose to his face, and he made a sound without words. "God help me, the winder," and the syllables were an appeal and a confession. "Call for water," the chronicler ordered. He knelt and held the wounded man's eyelids open to see if his pupils reacted. The wound bearer's lips moved. He tried to form a name. He could not. The chronicler dipped a scrap of linen in water and pressed it to a split lip. Blood spread on the cloth. The wound bearer choked a short laugh. "You will write this," he rasped. "You will write everything." The chronicler's pen trembled, but he wrote. He let his handwriting be the recorder and the actor both. Voices became a low thrum down in the tower office spaces where steps might arrive. The chronicler had always known that to take the ledger out was to risk men at doors. He placed his palm flat on the ledger and closed its cover a moment, as if to keep what was inside from leaking into the stone. "Stay with me," he said to the wound bearer. "Tell me what hurts where." The man's hands twisted on the rope. He named pain in single words: shoulder, hip, fabric tearing. Each word gave the chronicler Crete coordinates for medical description, and for what he would later read aloud in a council chamber. "Why did you measure so far?" The chronicler, the winder, "Why did you let the rope near a seat that frays?" The winder's reply was a sequence of practical priorities. The patron demanded consistent seats. We replaced where we could. The third seat bore more wear than the others when we set it. We meant to rotate. He touched his glove where colossus met leather, and the gesture was both an answer and a criticism of himself. Outside the immediate crisis there was an administrative scramble that would later form the scandal's backbone. The chronicler stepped back from the wounded man and wrote a new line in the ledger. Trial stopped by petition of chronicler. Patron named Master Aldred. Witness, winder result. Tendon rupture at third notch. He set the pen down with a small, decisive movement. "You will not wind again tonight," he told the winder. "You will sign that you will not wind again without written orders from a counselor above Master Aldred." He watched the winder's face crumple for a fraction and then mask back into a practiced composure. "The winder, they will find another. There will always be someone else." It was a statement of fact and an attempt at threat. The chronicler did not answer. He looked at the wound bearer and then toward the doorway where the first light of dawn would later seep into the chamber. He closed the ledger and placed the iron key on top. He set the ledger beside a guttering candle. The flame threw a small, obscene light across the inked name of Master Aldred. Then the winder did something the chronicler had not expected. He stepped toward the wounded man and, without complaint or theatrics, stripped his gloved hands of their oil and leather. He worked at the frayed rope with fingers that a minute before had cranked gears. He tied a more secure knot and eased the splintered wooden frame so it supported the wounded man's weight differently. "I cannot undo it," the winder in a voice made small, "but I can stop another hand from making the same mistake tonight." His voice held a kind of penitent craft. The wound-bearer's eyes tracked that motion with a raw gratitude edged by fury. He tried to speak the winder's name and managed only a broken syllable. The chronicler watched both men work. He felt the chapter close its circle. The man who had administered harm now administered a rudimentary aid. The man who had recorded now protected the record from being erased. One character's duty mutated into a different duty. By the time the first pale light pushed at the chamber's upper slits, the ledger was closed and tied with a scrap of string. The winder had washed his hands in a bowl and sat with his back against the stone, staring at the floor. The wound-bearer lay still, breathing through broken joints and a torn tendon. And the chronicler stood with the iron key in his pocket and the seal of Master Aldred written in black ink on the ledger's margin. The three men were caught in the wake of what had been done and the consequences their choices had set free. One final twist remained. The chronicler opened the ledger one more time, found the page where the winder had first logged the experimental trials, and found a small, overlooked notation in a different hand. A mark that tied not only to Master Aldred, but to a chamber further north, where similar devices were kept and where the patron had made orders to anonymize results. The notation changed the direction of the scandal. It implied a network, not a single patron. The chronicler underlined the mark with an authoritative stroke. That discovery altered the stakes. It expanded culpability beyond one named man. The winder looked up when the chronicler the name of the northern chamber. They will deny it, the winder. They will close those doors and call us liars. The chronicler closed the ledger and slid it into a satchel. He did not promise safety or justice in breathless terms. He promised a material movement. He would carry the ledger out of the tower and into the place where a seal meant something and where a name could be called to account. He left the empty rack as it was, a diff machine with a broken seat, a nut half spun, an iron wheel that had been turned one last time. They moved in ordered steps. The winder helped the wound-bearer into a wooden chair. The chronicler pressed a cloth to the worst lacerations. They bound what could be bound. The winder touched his burned knuckle where the ledger's page had brushed before. Nothing. The chronicler placed the closed ledger into the winder's palms for a moment and then took it back. He would not trust even a momentary custody when a key and a book could determine guilt. At the chamber door, the chronicler hesitated. He set the ledger on a low table and closed his fingers around the iron key, feeling its cold weight like a hinge between choices. The winder watched him. The wound-bearer watched him. The ledger hummed in the silence with the small, practical gravity of names and numbers and pressed seals. The chronicler walked out into the stair and down toward the daylight that would place this night's measurements into other hands. He did not say farewell. He did not make a speech. He left the ledger as evidence on the table and pulled the iron key from his coat before he opened the door. He placed the key atop the book. The act was concrete. A man leaving behind the instrument of action atop the record of that action. The winder's shoulders creased. The wound-bearer made a shallow sound and then slept, or fainted, or rested. It was impossible to name the phase precisely, but his breath came slower. Outside, the first-day workers began to make their rounds in the tower's lower courts. The chronicler walked with his coat buttoned and his ledger under his arm. He would, in days to come, read names aloud in rooms that had light and witnesses and the authority to force answers. For now, the chapter ended with a specific action. The chronicler carried the ledger beyond the chamber door and left the rack and its broken seat to gather dust and candle wax. That was the choice given and taken. It closed the immediate conflict, resolved who would hold evidence, and set the scandal's next movement into motion. He did not look back until a knock echoed behind him, firm, impatient, and unmistakable. He paused on the stair and then turned his head once. The sound was small, but it was a summons, a new entry to the ledger of consequences. He descended.